Well, good morning, and welcome to HLOM Java with Joe. Boy, this is a good audience here. This morning, I'm going to be giving you a program about an individual which I saw as a kid, his gravestone. Never thought much about it because I lived near the cemetery when I was growing up, and later on my father introduced me to the fact that he was a Confederate soldier back in the 60s and whatever. But the one thing is that when I decided to find out more about Philemon Tracy, it led to all different kinds of pathways throughout our local history, throughout New England, and of course in Georgia. The one thing I always learned from my mentor at UB in the history department was learn about the person. Yeah, history's humanity. Well, believe me, there's a lot of humanity in this. And it goes very deep into some interesting subjects. We might not imagine this individual or his family being involved in particular, of course, Philemon. So I will begin here. And of course, I hope, is everybody familiar with Philemon's grave by chance? Let me put this on here. Okay, so the marker is very plain, as you can see. And, written below, Richard Clark, who was a judge and gave this interview to the Weekly Georgia Telegraph. If a stranger happening in the city of Batavia, New York, were to take a stroll in the public cemetery, he might read upon a beautiful but plain marble slab, Philemon Tracy, with nothing additional but his age and time of death. It would not excite his curiosity or any other emotion to note the time was the 17th of September, 1862. This is where we'll begin now, with who Philemon Tracy was based on his family. Upper, lower, does it, let's see, we'll try, oh, no, that isn't it. No. Whoops. Yeah. Oh, well, I can go there. Can everybody see that?
No, you should bring it up full.
Yeah, okay. Okay, all right. On September 17th, 1862, there was a major battle. It was, to the Confederates, it was Sharpsburg, and to the Northerners, it was Antietam. And the two armies faced off. It was one of the most horrendous days, approximately 8 hours in engagement between the North and the South, and over 22,000 casualties were there. On that morning, there happened to be one unit which strikes a chord here. It was the 6th Georgia Infantry, and they were ordered to advance in the cornfield. This was early in the morning, of course, at 8 a.m. And at 9 a.m., the 6th Georgia was under heavy fire. They were engaged by the 12th Corps. And of course, there were several casualties taken. And you'll see here on the official Confederate record that has been made available, incidentally, just recently within the last year or so, that there's a P. Tracy killed September 17th, 1862, and here it's marked. What's on his grave? September 17th, 1862. Let us begin. This is the family of Tracy. They were early settlers in 1630. They came to New England, and they were the developers, so to speak, of the Connecticut River Valley. And of course, Norwich was their hometown, and they established that along with a few other notables. Dr. Philemon Tracy, which we see here in a very stoic portrait, he was a distinguished physician. He was the son of a distinguished physician as well. He married a family which had been embedded in New England called the Trott family. He is a doctor, of course. He specialized in chronic ailments, and he had an honorary degree from all of his research and things from Yale University. He had 6 children. 3 of the 4 sons graduated from Yale in law or medicine. Now this is where the family really kind of gets unique to our own locale here with Phineas Tracy, who became a judge, of course. You all know the name Tracy here. There's Tracy Avenue. There's other places in Buffalo that are Tracy Street have been named. He was the uncle to Philemon. He married Harriet Lay. The Lay family, of course, was well known in Batavia. He was a lawyer, the first judge of Genesee County, 3-term congressman, and no children. Philemon in his younger days spent a lot of time with Uncle Finn and Aunt Harriet prior to entering Yale and during his vacations. The Tracys, of course, lived at 215 East Main Street, which is now what used to be affordable floor covering on Main Street, the Silver Building down there next to the new construction. That's where their mansion was. Unfortunately, it's non-existent anymore. Let me read you a letter from Philemon at this time regarding his time here in Batavia to his father, who happened to be a judge as well. March 28, 1846. Dear Father, I have just undergone a long lecture from Uncle Phineas on account of having gone once upon last Sunday to the Episcopal Church. Nonetheless, I hope that I will be able to render this worthy of perusal. Well, you can tell where this guy's coming from right off the bat at 15 years of age. I have written to and received a letter from Uncle Richard, who is still my favorite uncle. Now, obviously, Finn didn't rate. And I have seen him, and the sight of him has only served to confirm my good opinion of him and the feelings of the greatest respect and love. Although Uncle P, Finn, is as kind to me as can be expected, yet I fear that he looks upon me as an evil which is to be deplored, but which cannot be removed. Wouldn't you like to be in that household? I believe that none of his family, save good Mrs. Comstock, really loved me. Now, Mrs. Comstock was the housekeeper, so, okay. He had one ally there. He complains that I am cold to him, and I think that it is he who is cold to me. Perhaps his fancied coldness has been productive of mind. If so, I am not conscious of it. Well, there you go. Okay, here we are with Richard. This is the homestead here in Connecticut, in Norwich. One of the brothers to Phineas was Richard. He was a doctor, of course, in Norwich. He spent most of his time, being a physician there, and also was treating the Mohegan tribe at that time, which brought quite a bit of notoriety because of research. The next gentleman, of course, is Buffalo, New York. We're getting local now. Here's Albert. He became, of course, a well-known lawyer. He studied classics, though, in the beginning. Didn't quite know where he was going. Yale was just down the road. He dabbled there for a while, but then he moved to New York State and studied law and became a lawyer. He married a woman by the name of Harriet Norton of Buffalo society, a congressman like his brother Phineas for 3 years. He had 2 sons. Phil corresponded with and visited them as frequently as possible. Keep this in mind, there are 2 sons. Down the road, this may play a role. I'm only giving you a clue. It is not definitive or fact, but it's a possible clue. Edward. Okay, here's the father to Philemon. He, of course, was educated, self-taught in Norwich. He left for the South in 1823 and went to Macon. Now, if you were from Connecticut and you were going to Macon, Georgia in 1823, boy, what did you have on your mind? So anyway, when he got there, he, being a great linguist as he was, which I don't know if that helped him in Macon or not, but he was a lawyer. He also became the mayor of Macon and Superior Court judge. This is where it gets the whole family dynamic. He was married first to Susan Campbell, and upon her death, married the sister, Rebecca Campbell. Yeah, all in the family. Susan's children, of course, were Anne, the eldest daughter, Philemon, and Edward Dorr, Jr. Then Rebecca, the second wife, the sister of Susan, had Caroline, Matilda, Campbell, and Harriet. This was the family dynamic that Philemon was growing up with. Rather unique in the sense that both families were combined and they had very similar interests as far as the law and all. This is where we start to develop a relationship with this young lady here, his elder sister, Annie. She was from Macon, of course, Phil's eldest sister, and I think you remember when I talked about Upton, how he had a confidant and two of his sisters. Same thing here. Phil found that Annie was the real confidant to him. She was educated at the Episcopal Institute, married William Butler Johnson, a financier in jewelry, banking, railroads, insurance, you name it, he did it. But he's a very interesting man in one sense, that he was the man who, at the end of the Civil War, went to New York City and went to the bankers and said, I need $1 million to start the railroad from Macon to Savannah. And guess what? They gave him the money because he had the power. He also built one of the largest homes in all of the South. Can you imagine 18,000 square feet for an Italianate home? Yes. And he was a man who didn't believe in secession. However, that might change as time goes along. But he was a very wealthy man. She benefited from it, but she was extremely close to Phil. General Edward Dorr, Jr., he was from Macon and also lived in Huntsville, Alabama. He was the younger brother of Phil. He was called Lit. What I found is, as you go along and read the letters, he has different terms or endearing names for certain people. You really have to try to figure this out. Lit stands for little brother. So he just abbreviates things. Anyway, he was a graduate at the University of Georgia, attorney in Macon and Huntsville, married the Steele family daughter, Ellen, and had 2 children. Here's something that's quite remarkable. 1861, same as what will happen with the other brother, he joined the 4th Alabama Regiment. He was killed, of course, in the early morning. This is another clue to what's coming. At the Battle of Port Gibson, Mississippi. He was buried at Port Gibson on the battlefield, or close to it, and later removed to Rose Hill Cemetery in Macon. This also has some similarities to what's coming with Philemon. Okay, we're looking at Philemon Tracy, his birth 1831 in Macon, born with some physical infirmities, lameness and nearsightedness. Keep this in mind, these are all clues. His early academics were in Macon and also in the north with his family. I think Uncle Phineas took a distinct role in educating him. Spent time with the uncles, as I say, attended Yale from 1846 to 1850, graduated with a bachelor's degree, rich in treasures, as he says, in philosophy, science, and literature. And in 1850, returned to Macon, became the editor of the Macon Telegraph, and at the same time studying law. It's interesting, here was the Tracy mansion at 215 East Main Street, which doesn't exist anymore. This is the home in Macon where Phil grew up, and brother and sister. And Norwich, the town green where his family had a home in Connecticut, of course. And of course, here's Yale. I'll read you a letter. Philemon to his sister Annie from Pittsburgh now. I don't know how he got to Pittsburgh, but this is an interesting one. I am now reading T. Lividius in Latin and I. Socrates in Greek. I am also studying algebra, geometry, and attending Dr. Bros's lectures on philosophy and logic. The latter, Dr. B, is an excellent scholar, and I do not think he can be exalted. I esteem him. I attend the debating society regularly every Friday night. It is the best thing to improve anyone that can be as every performance is critiqued. I know that you are now an elegant, accomplished, and polished young lady. This is speaking of his sister. In short, that you are a very prodigy. I know that you are an honor to the seminary which you attend, that you are the pride of perfection. This is important here. Give my love to dear Papa and Mama. Often I do miss the indulgent look of the former. Often I do miss the tender care of the latter. Often do I miss the numerous little indulgences which they both showered upon me with beneficent hand. Your affectionate brother, Phil. Now, he always signs it Phil Tracy or P. Tracy. It's never just, your son or whatever. It's always, he has to write it out. And he also says, P.S., much love to all the servants and Phoebe particularly. I presume these are people of color that are working in the household. So he does have an attachment to the household. Another one, Phil writes from New Haven, Connecticut to his father in 1849. This was a double letter. He started it, and then about 3 weeks later, all of a sudden he decides he needs to write more to this letter. On vacation for 2 weeks have passed since I wrote the former part of this letter. During the major portion of this time I have enjoyed leisure with dignity. What could that be? Okay. Meanwhile, the college appointments have been declared showing the scholastic station of each man in the class. I have taken an appointment and thought it is by no means the first. I can safely say I've borne away a college honor when the time arrives for me to receive my diploma. I hope it with some degree of certainty to raise my stand considerably. Okay. Thus, my dear father, I have disappointed you in expectations. Boy, is that any wonder? In that, a certain bulletin from one Gordon Hall tutor at Yale College did fill your mind with dire forebodings, and did make no float across your mental vision. Now, his words here are quite interesting. I'll say that again. And did make no float across your mental vision in terrible confusion, expulsions, rustications, and other monsters made of straw. Okay, only a guy who does philosophy could lay this on you like that. Anyway, I hope hereafter our correspondence may be more regular, more hearty, and that the good old times may come again. Whoa. When our letters received with mutual pleasure bring rich into feeling, my abound in that confidence that pure manly attachment which should always constitute the relations of father and son. Boy, this guy is really looking for some acceptance here at this point. I don't know what his academic standing was, but maybe it could have improved. Now, this goes on. He writes another letter to his sister. Obviously, he felt compelled to let her in on things too, from New London. I just stayed in New York 4 or 5 days and have since then been here in Norwich. I found Uncle Richard, which was the doctor I told you in Norwich, as unusual or strange as ever, and amiable. The rest of our relatives, and their name is Legion, I took no pains to ferret out. Well, I wonder what they did to get him, not wanting to show up. Your ideas of Uncle Richard are undoubtedly erroneous. It is the last person to please young ladies and would only mortify you by his appearance and mystify you by his countenance. Okay. Richard is not a ladies' man, it sounds. True, he is amiable and very full of information, but you would not think of these things when you saw his boots or his coats or his linen. I like him very much, a fellow of feeling. Oh gosh, Richard and him are compatible souls, right off the bat. At the end of 6 weeks, or the end of the 6-week course of study will have been completed. I shall then visit our uncles in New York and then turn my face homeward. Very affectionately. Now, I haven't ever seen him use this term at the end, your bro. Now, as you recall, if you remember one of my lectures on Upton, he always signed his letters affectionately your bro, to his sisters. So this must be a cool word to be using now. And again, it's signed P. Tracy, as if you didn't know it, so. Okay, who is Philemon Tracy? 1851, he started a law practice with his brother Lit. And of course, he was elected judge of the ordinary, which I don't know if anybody knows that term. Dave, is that a common word up here? Okay, that's probate court for Benton County at the age of 20. 1855, this becomes one of the exciting features to all of this in his legal history. And let me read you what is being said here. It's diabolical outrage and attempt to murder. R.W. Andrews, editor of the Georgia Citizen, 1855, in September. He, of course, was rather upset that he was accosted here. And so this is in the Georgia Citizen, and he writes this, the editor does. On Tuesday last, about 4 p.m., as the editor of the Georgia Citizen was returning from the post office, hands full of documents, he was unexpectedly and fiercely assaulted with a club in the hands of Phil Tracy, editor of the Georgia Telegraph, and abetted by his brother Ed Tracy and William King and 2 or 3 Irishmen. We were entirely unprepared for the outrageous assault, a more dastardly attack, therefore, never disgraced the annals of our court. For not only had this infamous scoundrel, Tracy, a spy at the post office, but he was fully armed with pistols to make sure the work which the bludgeon might fail to accomplish. And he also secured the services of a drunken armed bully to back him and his brother, the deacon, in their bloody work. To our American fellow citizens, we have today that we ask not for your sympathy, but your justice. The first American blood has been spilled in Bibb County, and if that blood is not summarily avenged upon every man engaged in this damnable conspiracy, our persons, you are not worthy of the cause to be espoused. Obviously, there's really some resentment here. Now, this gentleman who is bringing these charges, Andrews, is also part of the Know-Nothings. He also has a religious background as an evangelical. So there's more to the story, which goes much deeper. And I will read that now from the public. It goes to the public is the article written by Philemon Tracy, the Georgia Telegraph, September 1855. Justice to myself seems to demand that I give a true account of the late rencontre between myself and the editor of the Georgia Citizen. Words are not the weapon which I choose to answer insults, and I have never thought the columns of a newspaper the proper arena for the settlement of private quarrels. I speak on last Tuesday afternoon that the editor of the Citizen had been cruelly beaten by a Confederate band of armed ruffians. So far as the city is concerned, these are silly reports and no credibility. Fortunately for the whole affair, underwent an investigation by the city court on Friday last. After bearing testimony, the mayor discharged his brother, Edward Tracy, William King, and the Irishman, if that were the case. As for myself, I was fined $10. Now, he flogged this man to a point, and I'll say how in-depth this gets. The murderous weapon, which was his own lead cane, that was Andrew's cane. So he took the cane from the guy, because this guy was going to assault him, and he turned it on him. I wrestled it from him and flogged him severely with the same. He knows very well he lost his cane, and that was without the intervention of any third party. I make this statement because he has tried to elevate himself to a dignity of a political martyr. I declare distinctly that this affair was not political. It was aroused from a long period of insults purely personal to myself and not to connection with politics whatsoever. He insulted me grossly on more than one or two occasions. I have uniformly submitted to silence. In this paper of the 8th, he again insulted me, comparing me to a parasite whose slimy embrace was worse than death. Okay, can you imagine this one? I mean, come on. So I think Phil had enough. So I had only to ask myself whether I should submit to be insulted or whether I should punish him. Well, here we go. I was determined to flog him publicly, to flog him severely, and I accordingly did flog him in the manner already stated. I flogged the vagabond because he richly deserved it and for the particular state of the public mind at the present juncture. It is my honest belief that the whole community now would have been pleased to see him punished. Wow, the editor of this paper here really is not well liked, it appears now. And Phil says, he has been publicly whipped and now calls on the community to avenge him. P. Tracy. He leaves it at that. Well, as I told you earlier, he got fined $10 in court. The other individuals, which they didn't find any Irishmen, by the way. Let me go back and say that with the Georgia Citizen, they really did not like immigrants. They did not like people who were Democrats. Now, deep in the South, Democrats were very strong. There was a heavy bond there. So this guy had several problems with, I think, Phil just being who Phil was. Anyway, he got out of it for $10 and they moved on. In 1857, he married Caroline Rawls. Actually, she had been married before to a man, and their marriage only lasted a year. However, one of the stunning bells of Macon, her father, James Rawls, was a wealthy planter. Carrie and Phil married, and it only lasted for a year. I don't know if that was a sign or not, but obviously, when they had a child, they both died at her giving birth, unfortunately. And it was a sad moment in his life. However, he never remarried. It did affect him greatly. And due to his condition at the time, he was elected by the majority in the Georgia state government for the county of Bibb to be their senator. And he became very well known for his orations. He was very much in line with what the South was looking at for states' rights and slavery. Of course, secession was on his mind. And of course, in 1860, he was sent to the Democratic Party convention in Charleston with a group of other men. He left the convention with the other group, came back to Macon and said, I have to defend our action, certainly. You sent us to this convention to represent Bibb County in Georgia. And he said, I could not honestly stand there and vote on anything based on the now territories that were going to allow for property from the state of Georgia or any state that had slaves to be in those new territories with slavery. And that bothered him in the sense that they voted it down. Even in Charleston, South Carolina at that time, with several Confederate states, that bothered him. So he came back, he said to them, I'm explaining our position, why we left, walked out, because they were against having our property if we want to move to new territories. So he was taking a very heavy stand at that point. He also was at a public meeting and was given the nomination to go to the convention in the state of Georgia, and that's where they were against the Lincoln administration and in favor of secession. And he spoke rather openly about this. And you can see his name down here, and it was a public meeting, and he went into great depth about why he left the Charleston Convention and why he was hoping he could go on to represent them in the Atlanta. Okay. Now we're getting closer to Phil all the time here. Elected Major of the 6th Infantry Regiment, its organization was in May. He, honestly, if you remember what I said early on, when we were going with his birth date and his physical condition, he should have been exempt. And his position was on the staff. That meant a field staff. That doesn't mean you are behind the lines. And in these cases here with these regiments, you were in the field. In 1862, the infantry was engaged in the Peninsula Campaign, the Siege of Yorktown, the battles of Williamsburg, and the Seven Pines. I just want to make a note here about Seven Pines. It's interesting that several historians, and this is latter historians and current ones today, and this is a topic we're paying attention to all the time. Facts. What is the truth? How do we know what to believe? He was at Seven Pines, but he wasn't wounded there. And we have documentation to that fact, even though numerous authors, historians, and otherwise say it was at Seven Pines, because he wrote a letter about it. So, anyway, Seven Pines, he demonstrated great skills. Here's the one. 1862, on June 27th, his regiment was engaged in the 7 days battle at Gaines Mill. Right here. An intense battle, and of course, a victory for the Confederacy. Major Tracy was wounded and taken to a Richmond hospital. And of course, this is a drawing of the battlefield. And here's what it looks like today. It was rather interesting. We were down there on a trip where I was doing something on Upton on this battlefield, and a friend of ours who is the head of the Richmond National Park System was along with us. Sharon started talking about the cemetery and how there was a Confederate officer buried in it. Well, guess what? The name Philemon Tracy she mentioned he knew him. And he said, I'll show you where he was wounded.
Whoa.
Yes, it wasn't Seven Pines, it was Gaines Mill. And it was really kind of interesting because they carried out a whole conversation about this. But here a man in Richmond with the national parks knew all about Phil. He was sent back home to Macon to convalesce, and that was at the end of July. Here's a letter from Phil to his brother-in-law. This kind of gives you some insight. This is before he was engaged here, but it gives you an idea of what he was thinking about. William Johnson was his brother-in-law. Dear sir, boy, kind of formal, isn't it, for your brother-in-law? But that's how they were. The enemy are in front of us and with a tremendous force. This is at Yorktown now. General Magruder thinks 130,000 men, to which we have to oppose not 44,000 all told. The enemy are in plain view along a line of 10 miles or more and have been so for 5 days. The government are slow in reinforcing and perhaps doubtful whether a real assault is intended. Nobody doubts it here, and the action must be desperate. Our position is strong. The disparity of numbers is so great that I have little expectation of victory. When the ball does open, the dance will be lively. Here again is his phraseology. We shall give them the best fight we have about our persons, and that will be a good one. Now, this gets down to serious business here. That's why he's talking to his brother-in-law, the guy who's the financier. And now to business. My papers are in Ned's safe, and will explain my affairs to some extent. All of this course is in the event that I shall fall in action, a thing that may happen, if not, now sometime during the war. Truly your friend, P. Tracy. Interesting. So he was preparing for what was, happening here and where things were going. When he's here, he writes a letter to his sister again, Annie, from Richmond, July 3rd. No doubt you have heard, this is that I am laid up by the heels. Sometimes his writing really tongue twister. Heels in Richmond, one hole through my thigh and another through my face. The latter decidedly damaging those personal charms for which I arrest to celebrate. In another letter, a lady wrote and said that he was rather vain and he was quite concerned that his facial appearance to women wouldn't be, pleasing. I was wounded early in the engagement on the 27th and can give you no entertaining account of the battle. The fire was terrific and our regiment must have suffered greatly. I was shot in the face, a mini ball entering just below my right eye and going out near the lower front of my ear. The effect of the shot pretty much such as it produced a blow by a heavy cane. Wow, I would think more than a heavy cane would, I turned to go to the rear to have the wound examined. This poor guy. Now remember what I said. He was born with a limp. He's got sight problems. Here we go. Or rather, Stumpf led and supported one off. But we had gone only a few feet before another ball passed through my inner side of my right thigh, pretty effectively closing my military career for the next 2 months. He already has an idea that 2 months he's going to be back in action. Stump got the ambulance and brought me to town. I should come home as soon as my wounds permit, possibly about the close of the month. Your affectionate brother, P. Tracy. All right, we're getting now down to where September 17th becomes the real story behind all of this. September 17th, of course, and probably most of you know, or if not, was the Battle of Antietam that we would know. In the south, of course, it's called Sharpsburg.
The second battle you have there. The second battle of Manassas.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. Now here, of course, after the second battle, Lee heads north with the Army of Northern Virginia. He had plans to, go further if he could. However, this day on September 17th will be the nemesis for Lee in many ways. Early in September, of course, Phil is home in Macon, and he decides to rejoin his regiment. And even though he wasn't totally healed by any means, he leaves for Sharpsburg with much difficulty. He stopped on the way in Richmond. Several officers at that time came up to him who were friends and said, "You've got to be kidding me. You're going back into battle in your condition. You're not healed yet. What is wrong with you? You don't need to go." Well, Phil was headstrong, of course. He arrives late in the evening of September 16th, where the Georgia Regiment was encamped in the Sunken Road. This tells you a lot. When you're encamped in the Sunken Road, of course, later on, about 3 hours, the Sunken Road turned into what is called the Bloody Lane. And this is what it looked like at that time in 1862. This is what it looks like today. Much more pleasant today than what took place here a few hours after they had been encamped. They went into battle. Of course, early in the morning on the 17th, there was over 70,000 federal troops engaged with Lee's 35,000 who were worn and hungry near Antietam Creek. At 8 a.m. in the morning, the Georgia Infantry, part of Colquitt's brigade, advanced into Miller's cornfield to secure it and drive back General Gordon's brigade. By 9 a.m., the 6th Georgia, with Phil Tracy leading his men, of course, was outflanked and exposed to heavy fire and heavy artillery fire to the point of where there were very few left. In fact, the numbers of casualties were very high at this point. He received a wound to his thigh. You can see here's a drawing that was done. And this is from the northern side looking at the cornfield out here. And this really became the beginning of what Antietam was throughout the day.
So was this the second time he was wounded in the thigh? He was wounded in the...
Yes.
Yep.
Okay.
Was it the same time?
It's bad. It's bad.
One or the other.
I'll put it this way. There is no information on that part of it. No one is saying, I got shot again in the same leg, kind of thing. Here, I'll read you what has been written, of course, about a tribute to Philemon with the 6th Regiment. And this is regards to his condition going into this situation. This is from a Savannah Republican Gazette Army correspondent. He told me that he had not quite recovered his strength, which he had suffered a good deal from the wound received at Richmond, meaning Gaines Mill. But he is well enough, he said, to strike another blow for liberty. Wow, this guy just doesn't give up. He was, according to all military tests, an exempt. This he scorned to take advantage of and voluntarily entered the 1st Regiment, which enlisted, of course, to go to the war. He fought with valor at the Battle of Seven Pines and came out of the conflict unharmed. At Gaines Mill, he was twice severely wounded. As soon as able, he came home to recruit his severely impaired health. The writers saw him a few days before he returned to his regiment and could scarcely believe that the pale and feeble man before him was really the Phil Tracy of former days. So obviously, he was not looking good at all. This here, of course, is showing, that at the time in the morning when they were engaged, and this is the aftermath, of course, of what took place here. The casualties were mounting. For this particular regiment here, there were 250 men which they started with at 7:30. By 9, 81 killed, 115 wounded, and 30 missing. That's 79% of your unit. And believe me, they were not in great shape after that when they retreated. On the 18th and 19th, McClellan, who had repelled the invasion, really he didn't defeat the enemy by any means. Lee recrossed the Potomac, heading for the Shenandoah Valley, Winchester in particular, and leaving Union forces in possession of the field, dead and the wounded. Now that's very important here, because all of a sudden on the next line, we're looking at this and this. Major Tracy, now this is, I just discovered this. The whole story with Tracy and his family, but in particular Phil, has led me to places I would never believe and information. And I saw Richard the other day, and he said, on Friday last, and he said, "Are you ready to do your talk?" And I said, "Yes, I am." I just talked to him about having been in contact with Yale University for some information about Phil's academic standing. And all of a sudden, this past week, this comes into play through another source, and it says, Major Tracy buried in east end of trench containing 150 bodies of the 27th Georgia. He wasn't in the 27th Georgia, but here's the official notification, and it says buried on the battlefield of Antietam. He was at on Dr. Miller, or D.R. Miller's 50-acre field, which is what the cornfield would have been, plus other acres. East side of Pike, the trenches can be seen buried shallow. I didn't go on to be very descriptive, but in what was put forth in this document says that bones and everything were littering the field even though they had been buried. So keep this in mind now. He's been thrown into a grave, shallow, and what is going to be the future here for finding this fellow to bury him properly? March 1864, Judge Phineas Tracy, Uncle Finn, comes back into the picture again, dispatched a trusted representative to recover Philemon's body from the temporary battle grave and transport him back to Batavia through the Union lines. And here's a statement by a gentleman by the name of Lieutenant Thomas Marshall. He wrote to Phil's sister Anne again. Annie, as I say, has been the conduit for a lot of correspondence and information. And so it was on October 27th. Now, don't forget, September 17th was the battle. So this gentleman, who had been wounded as well, he was an officer with Philemon. On October 27, 1862, Mrs. Johnson, I received your letter of the 25th this morning and hastened to reply. Major Tracy, while gallantly moving to the front and inspiring the boys forward, was wounded, I fear mortally, and fell at my feet. I turned over and saw me, said he, Phil. Let me read this over. The writing here is very difficult. He turned over and saw me, said he, Marshall, in other words to the writer of this letter, I am gone this time. I said, I hope not, Major, at the same time kneeling by him. He said, yes, the artery in my leg is cut. I immediately took my handkerchief and tied it around his thigh above the wound as light as I could draw it. At the same time telling him I would get him off the field, to which he replied, well, if you can. By this time, there was no person present. I mean, don't forget, these guys were retreating now and trying to get back because the Union troops are right on their heels. Present to assist, so I stepped off a few paces and got some men to come and assist me in moving him. I hurried back, and just as I was stooping down to take hold of him, I was shot and fell by his side. Boy, this really becomes a whole tragic scene. When I fell, the men that came to assist fled and could be no more of service to the major. I pulled off my canteen and gave it to him to quench his thirst, and with difficulty I succeeded hobbling off to the rear where I got assistance and made my escape. He was not dead when I left him, though I thought that he was sinking from the excessive loss of blood, and I fear he did not live but a short time after. I think I will be able to visit you in a few days in Macon. Now, can you imagine that what this guy went through? Now, all of a sudden, he's got the guilt, after having been wounded himself, that he left the guy. Was he alive or dead? Now, there is one question here about all of this, which relates to a fact that, again, historians, authors, have written their assessment of it. That he was taken to Shepherdstown, Phil Tracy was, off the battlefield. Wounded or dead. No one can say for sure. And that Uncle Phineas, when he dispatched somebody, sent them to Shepherdstown. This is not true, based on what this gentleman was talking about, and also what is here. Because this here has identified him based on Confederate records. And again, too, don't forget, his body has been buried in territory that is now occupied by the Union Army, which complicates things tremendously. Okay, now your introduction to Phil Tracy. Does he not wear glasses? How could he see anything? Phil was a charming guy. I know when he was first wounded, he was really worried about his face being blemished so the young ladies wouldn't like him. But here he is. 1864, under secrecy, Tracy's body was passed through the Union lines and brought to Batavia for burial on March 15th, 1864. Now, September 17th, 1862. So there's a time lag here. You saw with the document that said where he was buried and how he was buried. Was there much left here to decipher who he was? He was brought here to Batavia with the gravesite funeral by the rector of St. James Episcopal Church. Now, I did look in the St. James records, and we go back to the first letter he wrote his father in 1846, and what did it say? His uncle was really giving him a lecture on the fact that he wasn't going to church. So here he gets the rector from St. James Church. Well, in the records, they have Phil put down as a member. Now, he did spend time here, but I don't know if Phil was an official member, how much time he spent. But anyway, they gave him the proper burial. And the one thing, too, is that they say that they put him in a Union uniform. I don't know if someone would risk that or not. That could have been a real problem. And the person who would be doing the transferring of the body, what would be left into a Union uniform would be pretty difficult, I think. Some have said they put a cloak over him, a Union one. Again, who knows for sure? There's nobody to tell us otherwise. And the records, other than what has been stated already, don't state anything about who the person was. But if you go back, it said a trusted messenger, Phineas, who had somebody who might have been related in the area here. Does anybody remember? Albert. Remember Uncle Albert? He had 2 sons. Is it a possibility? Because there was some kind of mark on Phil's body that one would be familiar with. Well, he did go to visit his cousins. They got to know each other. A sidebar on this too. Uncle Albert, who was a distinguished lawyer, had the 2 sons. Now, I don't know which one possibly could have been one of the been a messenger, but it is interesting to note that one of the sons was the runner-up to the world's drinking whiskey lord. Now, again, we have to look back at these families. They were rather distinguished, and it was Frank Tracy who went to New York City. He had all kinds of friends on Wall Street and whatever. He did take the liberty of having a rather, how can I put it, joyous life, carefree. It was not connected to any profession in particular, but drinking. So he was drank under the table by another gentleman in New York City for the World's Championship. I think he drank 16 glasses of whiskey. He was not cognizant on the 16th or the 15th or the 14th, but he drank them anyway. So that's it. Do you think this guy in 1864 could have gone down to Sharpsburg and figured out where the body was? So anyway, that's a little sidebar. So in 1868, Union soldiers for the first time graves were decorated. General Logan, who had fought with Sherman and was the head of the GAR at that time, post-Civil War, really pushed to have some kind of commemoration for Civil War veterans who had passed, and for the organization, the GAR, to take care of its members currently living at that time. There was another connection here too. Major Henry Tarbox of Batavia. He had been engaged in the war, of course, and he, for some reason, he might have known Phil, I don't know. Tarbox became a lawyer, but he was aware of several people, probably Phineas Tracy, and mentioned to the GAR, the Upton Post, that they had a Confederate buried in their cemetery. And that did not go over well at first. There had to be some discussion about this. And finally, they had a resolution. They said, you know, he was a soldier, he was familiar to the community, and he fought for what he felt was right, but he was a soldier. So let's honor him in the sense of being a soldier. And so in 1907, the Julia Jackson chapter of the Children of the Confederacy started to send floral tributes to be placed on the grave. And from that point on, the Upton Post, the GIR, did, of course, decorate the grave here in 1907. And that's what the grave looked like initially when they began honoring him. Again, you just notice how plain it was. There was nothing there. We go here. It took quite a while, but he remained unknown because that's all that was there. And between 1989 and 1990, a government bronze plaque was organized by Charles Chambers of Houston, Texas. He was a friend of my father's. He was at the Houston Round Table. He was a former executive for Exxon. And when he retired, he went around the entire United States finding all the graves of Confederate generals who were buried. Now, this is quite a task, and amazingly enough, there's more Confederate generals buried in the North than you know. They migrated, they spread out. In fact, at one point, John B. Gordon, I don't know if you're familiar with him, but he was a leading division and corps commander for Lee, who had gone to Antietam. In fact, he was wounded 7 times there. Facially, his face was destroyed due to the woundings. And he came to Batavia, and it was around 1900. And he was a U.S. senator, in fact. So, I mean, this man had been given a reprieve. He became a U.S. senator, and he was doing a tour of New York State. And he came to Batavia. And he came to talk to the Upton Post here, and it was brought to his attention there was a Confederate buried here. And he said, well, who? And don't forget, John Gordon was from Georgia. So they mentioned the name, and he says, I know the name, Philemon Tracy. He came to the cemetery to honor the grave, and all the Union soldiers there as well. It's quite interesting, but it's impressive who showed up to remember Phil Tracy. I'll read this. We now pause at this of the one endeared to us, the Weekly Georgia Telegraph. And this is 1863 now. We're looking at it, and I'll read something later on and how things were said. A great man, and this was done by the court system in Macon. And they had, of course, heard that he had been killed. A great man fell, and a genius was extinguished. A great heart ceased to beat when Philemon Tracy was no more. In boyhood, he exhibited a judgment power of discrimination far beyond his years. Boy, did he. The genius he exhibited developed itself early, and some of his youthful efforts gave unquestionable evidence of his future brilliancy. Well, some of it was, and when you flog somebody, I don't know if that's brilliancy or what, but he obviously had his own unquestionable means of doing things. In his position as editor of the Georgia Telegraph, he was widely known for no man brought to discussion of political questions more clear, vigor, and point. While he was never uncourteous, the pen he wielded never flattered in probing bad men or bad measures. Obviously, the gentleman who did the other paper in Macon was a bad guy in his opinion. Many of his articles were published and republished throughout the country. And then it goes on to say, of course, he was elected to the probate court at the age of 20. In 1851, he entered the bar, and he was also a co-partner with his brother, General Dorr Tracy, in a law office. In 1856, he became more prominent, and his wife had passed. By a large majority, he was selected for the Senate. We've already talked about that, but they're going through and paying all of this esteem to him because of his character that they knew. And in the social life, his conversation was perpetual spring of enjoyment. His genius never tired, but was constantly throwing off sparks of wit. Boy, he must have been the entertainment part of every party. No man wearied of listening with all these powers, rivaling Addison in grace and purity of diction and possessing a humor as delicate as that of Cervantes himself. He had no ostentation, no desire for display. No man cared less for applause. No, he was modest and gentleness overflowed the river of his soul. Wow, this is really quite the flowery ending to his career. After great troubles, he arrived, and now they're describing, of course, just before Antietam. We see him as he sits down to supper. Colonel Newton, Captain Anderson, and himself form the party. He just arrived and is giving his own graphic language, picturing the way his history of his troubles to reaching them. One remark looking to the morrow, for it is the evening before the fight of Sharpsburg. He hoped he would not have arrived. Can you imagine? He arrived late in the evening, and if he had arrived a little later because of the problems with transportation, don't forget he was going through Union lines. You know, this wasn't an easy trip. He might not have ever been killed. But anyway, they put this in this epitaph to him. And thus from sleep to opening of the Battle of Sharpsburg, among the first and amid the thickest gallantry, leading his men, is seen P. Tracy. On a motion of Mr. Lanier, he was a former colonel, the court then adjourned as a token of respect to our deceased brethren. So consequently, you know, there was all kinds of feeling for Philemon. Most of them didn't know where he was. Don't forget, 1862 to 1864, he finally found a place at that time. And the one summary here that Judge Clark, he was the opening person to the, oops, go back here for a second. He was the one person who had really a close connection to Phil from his birth on through, knowing his father very well. Being a judge as well with his father, Edward Dorr, he could really examine how Phil grew up and what he was about. And here's what he had to write in his memoirs. Phil Tracy had a kind uncle residing in Batavia, New York, who, hearing of his sad fate, dispatched a trusty messenger in search of his remains. That messenger was successful in finding them. They had been interred with the other officer comrades. He knew Phil well, and the identification was free from any doubt from a mark, which will be made to appear in the sequel. Okay, he's talking about a mark. Was it on the bones? Was there much left? I don't mean to be graphic here, but I mean from 62 to 64, there's quite a bit of time in there. I don't know many people laying in a open grave, so to speak. Anyway, how they identified him, we do not know. Anybody who says that they have more evidence to that, I would love to see it, but only going back in those times, if we could time travel, would we know? I'm positive. It was not only certain that the body of a rebel would not be permitted by the soldiers to be taken north, but the life of the messenger would be endangered as well. Everything for transportation was prearranged with much caution and secrecy as possible. And when the preparations were all made, the body was passed through the lines as a federal officer. Again, this is history, historians, writers. That's questionable. I mean, again, as I mentioned earlier, how do you put bones into a uniform? You know, it's questionable there. And of course, then he goes on to say about the service at the Christian burial at the gravesite. And the monument was soon placed over the grave, and the inscription was meager because there was imminent danger that the stone would be raised or defaced. So, you know, this was the major worry, that there would be some resentment, of course, towards this family or towards Philemon himself being a Confederate. I've said that Major Tracy had physical defects of limp limb in sight. It is not strange that a man who was too lame to march and too blind to shoot could succeed in the role of a soldier, and yet he did. He was so nearsighted that without the aid of glasses, he could not tell his best friends 6 feet away. His lameness was, according, the same as that of Byron. So too, if blind or of defect, vision approaching blindness, the child is apt to be gifted in music or poetry, where the tongue or fingers can serve in delight without or with very little sight. Major Tracy's case, nature had so bountifully compensated him for his lameness and his intellectual supremacy that there was no margin to make other amends in the way of the fine arts for his want of sight. So anyway, here's several accolades that described him in different ways through the newspapers and people who know him. And of course, later on, this all became a recognizable symbol of who Philemon Tracy was. And again, if you look at him, he's not wearing glasses. So maybe he was vain and took off. Of course, this is an earlier picture, don't get me wrong. But he doesn't look like the individual that's being described. Now, there is a question mark. There is a annual book that's put out every year for the class, the graduating class at Yale. There happened to be one for 1850. The young lady I was working with at Yale said, I'll check the volumes. There were several volumes. Well, guess what? Phil's picture doesn't show up. How unusual is this? Knowing Phil. Anyway, we have no other way of knowing. Back in 2013, I contacted the Hay House, which is, if you remember, his sister Annie, the 18,000 square foot Italian Renaissance house. They have a archive there, and they also have, a tour of the household and everything. This young lady said, well, we don't have a picture of Phil. I said, well, why don't you have a picture of Phil? I said, he's buried here. My wife, being the head of the cemetery, would really like to know what this guy looks like. Well, we don't really know. So about 5 weeks later, I get this email, and that's when I was working downtown at the bid, comes across, and all of a sudden, found one. And I said, found what? And she says, we found Phil. I said, oh, okay. They tore apart all of these pictures that they had, looked on the back, and of course, they call him Philip. Now, whoever labeled it, he was never known as Philip. He was always known as Phil. It was real simple. But whoever wrote that, she said, I think this is him. So she sent it to me. I said, whoa. Well, he certainly doesn't look like the person I imagined, who was lame and, wounded or whatever. But, and of course, as I say, this is earlier, but physically, he doesn't look like that kind of person you would imagine. So we're wondering if this is Phil. And to this day, we'll be searching for another picture. In the meantime, we'll say this is Phil. This gets down to honor Major Tracy. I had to put this in. This is my father, who was a historian on the Civil War. And he also was on the board of directors here many, many years ago. And was always very interested in history. And one day he decided back in 1970 to call Governor Carter's office, Jimmy Carter's office, and said, we have one of your boys laying here, and we'd really like to honor him. And he said, well, what would you like? And he said, well, could we get a flag for the grave? Look at the size of this thing. Yes, that's the flag for the grave. Anyway, it is not there. It is rolled up and put away. Now you say, well, that gentleman's in a Union uniform. Yes. At home, he is better known as Jimmy. James Hildreth. This uniform belonged to James Hildreth of the 4th Heavy Artillery, and he was from Nunday, New York. Well, my father purchased this uniform back in the early 60s, and Jimmy has been in our household ever since. And just as a sidebar, when people have walked into certain rooms where he is, they're scared to death. All of a sudden when they flip on the lights and they see, because he is a mannequin. So when my dad decided that way he would honor him being in the uniform, and so much for Philemon. But can you imagine sending this flag? My dad said, what am I going to do with this? So it's been rolled up and just waiting. The museum will get it one of these days. And so here's just a list of credits, the people that I've worked with so far. And it's been a real pleasure to work with them. I've learned a lot. There's a lot more to understand. And again, it all goes back to the understanding of your subject and, as a historian, dealing with the human element, who this person really was and how he lived his life. So anyway, thank you, and I hope it
Any questions?
Yes.
Where was the Julia Jackson Society for the Children of the Confederacy? Was that from Georgia?
Yes, yes.
And so they knew, okay.
Yes, they had known about him because of the Johnson family, Phil's sister. Again, as I mentioned, after the Civil War, Johnson went to New York to get money for the railroads again. Now, to tell you a little bit more, and this is why the connection with the Confederate daughters, Johnson was totally against secession at the beginning. His wife couldn't even take him to public gatherings, parties, because people knew he was not for secession. It came down to the fact of finance, which it always does, doesn't it? The Confederacy approached him and said, guess what? You know, you're siding with the North. And he said, well, you know, I have a lot of investments and things like this. And he said, well, you know, that's not going to go over too well. He decided that for the betterment of things, there would be a way he could work through this. They gave him the position of Commissioner of Loans. Right up his head. The finance. He all of a sudden said, oh, I'll take the job. His thoughts were, at the end of the war, which he figured would be coming relatively soon, he would be able to arrange loans with countries to help the Confederacy, but after the war, he could go back to those countries and businessmen and investors and say, can you help us restore the South? That was his whole mission. And so, interestingly enough, from being an abolitionist, so to speak, to becoming the Commissioner of Loans for the Confederacy, he helped restore the state. His wife, of course, and he were well connected, and having been in the Confederacy, the Confederate daughters, of course, were informed, and it went through the whole channel. But if he had remained a secessionist or against secession, things might not have happened quite that way. So, but they every year would send flowers. Yes.
When he was a state senator and he spoke after some convention, was that concerning about the opening up of territories and whether there would be free or slave, and whether you could take, if you were a slave owner, whether you could take slaves as property to these? Was that the issue?
Yes. What happened in Charleston was, this was the National Convention for the Democrats, and of course the Democratic Party was the main party in the South and many in the North. There were several northern states represented and several southern states. The northern states, along with a couple or three southern states, voted against that. That upset him. Being a lawyer, he said, yeah, well, the Supreme Court said that there was no issue here at this time regarding that.
So he was kind of pro-slavery and opening up these
Yes,
territories as slave states.
You have to remember, too, in his letter, he said, please give my love to the servants and to Phoebe. And here's the other interesting thing. The rector, who was at St. James Church, had a young lady who was in their household as a servant, Addie. Now, he was certainly aware of black people in the North, in that connection. He obviously didn't have any issues. He never came right out and blatantly said that I do not like black people. He was just based on, I think, the premise, and this is only my assumption now from what I've read, that states' rights and the idea of slavery was okay based on that. There's the combination of two things. You can't go telling us we can't do this. And also with what the Supreme Court ruling was at that time. So, obviously he felt very strongly about serving Georgia and the Confederacy. So, but you're right, Dan, that was that whole issue. Yes?
Do you know what instigated the attack on the postal workers?
Well, that was the editor. Is that what you're referring to?
Well, I don't know, somehow Phil was there and he beat a guy with a lead cane to ward off the perpetrator or something, if I understand right?
Well, yes, his name was Andrews, and it was the Georgia Citizen. He didn't like Phil. Phil was, of course, the editor of the Macon Telegraph. He didn't like Phil because he called him all kinds of names,
Yeah.
And it came down to the fact that Phil had friends who were immigrants. He was a Democrat, which
Yeah.
didn't go over well. All of these things became an issue.
Well, I wonder why, if I understood, some guy was carrying all these documents.
Yes, he was.
From
That
post-
was the editor of
So
the editor.
why was he attacked? Was he attacked?
He was attacked. As I stated, he was carrying a cane.
Yeah.
And now, again, how could you be carrying a full load of documents and carrying a cane? Well, what the court found in the investigation was that he might have been carrying documents, but he was carrying a cane. Now, Phil did not have a pistol when he approached him. Phil had a club, but he took the cane from the guy because he was going to be assaulted with the cane. He didn't need to use the club. He didn't have a pistol in his pocket. He didn't have 2 or 3 Irishmen behind him. His brother and another guy were there, but they did not assist in the assault.
So it sounds like it was really nothing about the documents. These guys just did not get along. They didn't like
They
each
did
other.
not, and it was the insults. And as he said, I'm not going to write about this in my newspapers and editorial. I feel that I can flog this man publicly with justice. It was a matter of this newspaper too. Only survived about two or 3 years, and they were connected with the Know Nothings and some other groups that really were kind of obscure to the general thinking in the South.
One more question. Do you think it was unusual on either side for a body to be brought back and then somebody to put the opposing either Union or Confederate uniform or shawl, whatever, on them of the opposing army?
Well, first of all, I think if Phil had been alive, it would have been an insult. But I just can't imagine that by 1864 there were enough Union uniforms laying around or anything to put him in. And if he were bones or at least in a skeletal condition, how you could do this. I think he was brought back by somebody who could identify, maybe he had a broken leg at some point, or his leg maybe he identified, or something in the skull.
Maybe they put a blanket on him.
I think that's probably it. And they brought him back. Of course, there would have been questions about who's in the box, certainly. So they probably kept that low key.
Thank you.
Yes.
How did Uncle Finn get to Batavia? What drew him?
Uncle Finn, when he graduated from Yale, came to Albany, first of all, to practice law. And for some reason, he headed west, and he ended up here. And his brother Albert did. Now, Albert had studied medicine. He was also educated in the classics, and then he studied law in Buffalo, New York. But Albert came to Buffalo, and I mean, when you look at Buffalo back in the 1840s and 50s, it was a whole different time. But Phineas, he was a real, how can I put it, instrument of justice here. He became the first court judge. He represented the constituency here in Congress for quite a while, and was quite a disciplined individual, as you can see. Phil and him probably had a few go-arounds. Yes?
Were those common names in the day? Like it's pretty uncommon of a name now, Phineas, Philemon.
They were, and of course, again, you'll recall Phil used to use, like for Phineas, Uncle Finn, he would call them all by these names, and it's really hard to decipher. There's Tisti, who is another sister. I don't know which one, because it's hard to identify beyond that how they called themselves. But he had a great passion for, like, his brother, Dor, he would call him Lit. And first he'd say, Lit, little.
I've come across a lot of documents where names they would even went by different names, sometimes known as, sometimes known, even the official records.
It's something you want to
Yeah,
see.
yeah. Oh, wow.
Go back.
Yes. Okay.
So we have an object that is loaned to us from Sharon Burkel, the president of the cemetery. And as you can see from this photo, we have the grave marker that was on Philemon's grave. Sadly, there are sticky hands around everywhere, and people were stealing grave markers out of the cemetery. So the past president luckily took Philemon's out before somebody took it. So if you want to come see it, I will have it in my hands. I won't set it down anywhere because it is a heavy and it is very dirty.
It's a federal offense to take those markers too. It's a federal offense.
Yeah, that didn't
So maybe
matter.
that doesn't stop.
So if you want to come look at it, or I can walk around with it, we have it to show you guys.
The other thing too is, in this picture here, especially putting that up today would be a problem, that the cemetery felt that every year someone would bring a Confederate flag. We never know who, and it was a gentleman last year, drove in, an elderly man, got out of his SUV and walked over and put the flag there, a Confederate one. Well, it raises problems with certain people in the community so that they don't have vandalism or other things. They don't have the Confederate flag anymore. They put the American flag on his grave just because of attitudes right now, unfortunately. But for years, they would always, somebody would deliver them, and I don't know if it was this man or not, but it always showed up. So it's a shame. We can't leave these things because this was his battle flag.
Beautiful.
But, that's another story.
Well, thank you again,
Thank
Don.
you, yeah.
Thank you everybody for coming out today. Just a little PSA of upcoming events. Next Wednesday, May 1st, is our next guest speaker. John Zach will be here, and he'll be talking about his new book, Built to Burn, which is about the Cleveland Hill School fire of 1954. So it'll be at 7 o'clock. And next Friday, we have a concert with Bart Dentino, who will be doing a nice acoustic guitar show, also at 7 o'clock. So we hope that you'll
By the way,
come.
it's his first one after all of these years in silence.
So
Did you
it's
say Thursday?
Wednesday and Friday.
Friday is the music.
Friday is the music, yes. And for any of who is a member, and if you're not, please become a member. But if you are currently a member, we are doing our bylaws meeting on Tuesday at 6. So if you would like to come to vote on that, please let us know. But other than that, Please feel free to look around the museum while you're here. And I almost forgot, but May 16th, our newest exhibit is opening that Tyler has been hard at work on wedding dresses throughout time. So we hope you come to the opening, which is May 16th at 6 p.m. But the exhibit will be up through the end of the year. So it'll be a very impressive display once it's all done. Thank you, everyone, and have a good rest of the day.